Artificial intelligence is here. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Daniel Lopez. This is the AI Education Conversation, where we explore the opportunities, risks, and the impacts of AI across education. Let's jump in. I've worked with students for the last decade, mostly through college access, and I've noticed the trend over the last couple of years. When you ask many young people today what their aspirations are, it might involve YouTube, video games, or social media in what folks now content creation. We also continue to have many students who aspire to hone their abilities in the arts, acting, music, writing, either to pursue content creation or to walk down conventional artistic pathways. In our emerging world of artificial intelligence, where we're seeing tools which can generate images, song, music, text, video, in minutes, what will artistry look like? How can we prepare our aspiring artists and content creators to be successful in this world with the current AI disruption? Dr. James Hutson has quite a few thoughts here. Before we fully dig into my conversation with James, let's share a few AI updates. This should be a fun one. City lawmakers in Porto Alegre, Brazil, unknowingly passed the nation's first AI written legislation, according to AP report. This week, City Councilman Ramiro Rosario disclosed that he had used ChatGPT to write an ordinance that prevents taxpayer charges for stolen water meters. Rosario presented the draft to 35 other council members without disclosing its AI origin. Had he revealed its AI origins, the proposal likely wouldn't have gone to a vote, Rosario told the AP. In October, the council unanimously approved the ordinance, which took effect in late November. He was also quoted as saying, "It would be unfair to the population to run the risk of the project not being approved simply because it was written by artificial intelligence." To zoom out a little bit, other lawmakers worldwide, including Democratic State Senator Barry Feingold in Massachusetts, have also used it to help draft an AI regulation bill, which is currently pending a vote. Though, if you read the article, Barry Feingold was adamant about saying that any type of bills written through AI, ChatGPT, should actually have watermarks to show that they were generated using artificial intelligence, whereas what Rosario did seemed to skirt past that. So, interesting. We're continuing to see a lot of different ways that folks are beginning to use AI tools, even as in high stakes situations, such as passing legislation to be able to do their work. Let's turn to a couple of updates in the spirit of today's episode on artistry. So many artists, they're now beginning to fight back against AI large language models by poisoning them. That's right, I said poisoning them. One such tool is called Nightshade. Currently, a lot of large language models such as GPT-4, Bard, some of these tools that are created, the way that they're able to generate images and art is because they're trained. They're trained on millions of images and data sets that are mostly available through the internet. Most of the images, the graphics and things that they have collected to vacuum and be able to train their models, they've done so without the permission of their creators. Artists are now responding through tools like Nightshade, which essentially changes hundreds of pixels in the images that they've created. But the human eye, when a human looks at it, you wouldn't be able to detect any distortion or confusion within the image. It looks totally clear and normal, but a lot of the pixels are disoriented. When they run these distorted images, or these images that have been drafted by Nightshade, if you will, into these AI models to be trained, what ends up happening is these models end up becoming confused, and they see the images distorted, especially when they're trained on multiple Nightshade images over time as they become to multiple images. And then the impact of that is, over time, an AI model that has been trained on a lot of poisoned image can actually produce images that are spotty and distorted. So essentially, if you're using a Dolly or a Stable Diffusion or something like this, and you're typing in, "I want a castle and with a fantasy background," and over time, if it becomes poisoned, it may have images that look very spotty, that look pixelated, and just otherwise look distorted. It essentially is the equivalent of giving these models a virus. I will say that at a high level, this reaction to me makes sense, especially in the landscape of our current AI disruption, where there's so many artists who've dedicated their lives to developing their artistic ability, and yet they're having their life's work vacuumed up by AI models without any compensation. I think our guest today, Dr. James Hutson, he's actually going to have a lot to say about, and he's going to really help us unpack strong reactions from the art, the media communities, such as tools like Nightshade, these mass strikes that have been happening across different vocations, and a lot of these lawsuits around copyright that have popped up. Yet that being said, it's not stopping here. AI tools are going further in creating not just art, but they're actually creating people, people who don't exist. Some companies are now using these fake AI avatars, which, up to this point, we know that there's websites out there that have existed where you could see like a face, and there's websites like, oh, it's not real, it's a face. But now it's being taken a step further where there's marketing companies that are creating full on fake avatars and personas for the purpose of social media creation. One such company, called The Clueless, has developed a highly successful social media influencer called Aitana Lopez. She has really caught a following of over 130,000 people. And potentially the reasons for that, she has really trendy pink hair. She takes a lot of really pristine images. I'm saying she, but again, it's an avatar. Um, and when you look at the page, it looks like your typical lifestyle influencer, celebrity influencer. But again, she's not real. And I think my takeaway really from some of these updates here above everything is that our young people are going to have a really increasingly complex world to navigate. And they are going to have to learn how to navigate a world where the majority of information and potentially even people on social media are fake. It's going to be really interesting to see for me how this AI avatar trend in particular continues to evolve, whether it's social media or in other places. Um, but again, we're seeing that these tools are so sophisticated now, and artistry is really becoming redefined. I think that's a great segue into our conversation today with Dr. James Hutson. James Hutson, he's a lead XR disruptor and professor at Lindenwood University. Dr. Hudson also heads the AI initiative and the AI ambassadors, overseeing numerous studies on the integration of AI into all majors at Lindenwood. Dr. Hudson has also published over 100 books, periodicals, and papers. Thinking about our conversation, I have been fascinated about the AI disrupted in media over the last few months. I've read countless articles on it. I've thought about it a lot. And I will say that entering this conversation, I thought I had some context on why this was happening, why these strikes, such as the SAG strike was taking place and these lawsuits. But I think James really challenged my thinking here and made me realize that this AI disruption, though it is familiar in some respects, it's actually like really complex and multifaceted, and I think he helps to unpack that today. I think beyond this, I found James's journey from the department head of art history and visual culture into what he is now as a very prolific AI XR researcher. He's also, as I mentioned before, the lead XR disruptor, to be so fascinating. I think if any of you out there just need motivation for how you can dip your toe into this technological revolution we're experiencing right now, if you need the motivation to realize how much you can learn and grow over a few years, I think his journey in particular is really going to catch your eye. Above all, James provides some really great tactical strategies and experiences I think we can all learn from as we navigate this increasingly complex world of AI. As always, let me know what you think about today's conversation. Feel free to message me on LinkedIn, respond on the episode directly. Curiosity opens doors, connections build bridges, learning paves the way, humans at the heart of education. All right. Dr. James Hudson, welcome to the AI education conversation.
Thank you. Great to be here. Thank you for the invite, Daniel.
Yeah, I mean, I know I was just saying this kind of off the record here, but I'm really excited to have you. I think in a world where, I'm a newcomer to AI and learning about AI in this last year. Very ironically, that we're doing this episode just a couple of days after the first year really of like ChatGPT being released, and I know since then there's a lot of newcomers into the field. But I think what I've just observed about your experiences in the field of higher ed and AI in particular is you're just very prolific. You have so much going on related to publications, conversations, experiences that you've had. And I think you're going to bring a very different perspective related to this that I'm very excited to just dig in with you. And so before I get too far into the rabbit hole of my questions and what I'm curious about, and I'd love to first just ask you, I mean, as somebody who is not a newcomer to the AI space and is actually was thinking about AI even before ChatGPT emerged and became mainstream, like What drew you to AI and researching AI, and how did you end up where you are now?
Thank you. Yeah, we actually got about to AI in a roundabout way. I was put in charge of online and graduate programs back in 2016 and realized that I needed to learn a lot. And so went back, got another degree in game design to learn different game engines, etc. Because then I was told to start integrating virtual reality right before the pandemic, right? So ways in which that we can collapse space and time for online learners who could be anywhere in the world, different time zones. So how do we give those kind of direct immersive experiences to them? So we started that with an institution-wide integration project to get virtual reality integrated into all the disciplines. Mine was relatively easy because I actually come from a background in art history, and so everything that we cover, obviously, you need to be able to travel all over the world to see these sites. So it was a no-brainer to start integrating there and looking at use cases, then making our own experiences. Now we do our own digital twins, we make our own virtual museums. We're working with other international constituents to recreate lost or damaged artifacts, etc. But once that was all set up, and we were already working in emergent tech in many different ways, I was told, well, now you need to start focusing on AI. And so that was back in 2021, early on. And so after we had a good founding in XR, we set up an XR lab. We got all the human subjects research. We started building a cohort of international researchers in that field. So you'll notice that a lot of people who were XR experts, right, previously now added XR AI, if you look at their titles on LinkedIn, because to create the content, you kind of have to know a little bit about AI to begin with. So when you're going in and making these experiences, whether it's going to be, mobile, web, and or game engines, you need to know something about the AI behind it as far as, scripting, coding, etc., in order to ensure predictable experiences and or replicable experiences. So we started with that. We did an institution-wide study to see how is it already being used. This is pre-generative AI. In all fields. We brought together everyone from education to business, for our entire institution here at Lindenwood. And we just had them, they made up the AI ambassadors we still have today as the go-to people to see how can I use this in my area, right? So someone in biology might not find how I use it as directly applicable as someone in their own department, right? Chemistry, business, whatever that might be. And so we did that, found out that everyone was already using it, but it was kind of under the hood, right? So they didn't know they were using it. And so that's the big difference that we were seeing in the past year. As you mentioned, yesterday was the first birthday of ChatGPT. So that was just 1 year ago since the stable release. So we were doing studies at that time with 6 other generative writing tools right before, and that was the last tool we used this time last year in one of our studies, which now you can read as working with and not against them technology in the classroom. And so with that, we kind of opened up and realized that there was a lot more potential that was that we had moving forward with education. So after doing our institution-wide study, I actually have another colleague here who is in creative writing, but he also does Python scripting and coding. And so he was making his own algorithms. So we started off with studies, seeing if we could help creative writing students be more creative using these different algorithms. So we deployed it in Spacey, gathered the results, and it was the first time that will set the stage for pretty much everything else we'll discuss today and what we're dealing with at this moment. We were surprised that they were perfectly happy to admit that these tools, much like Grammarly or Microsoft Word correcting incorrect grammar and or spelling, they were fine to admit that it helped them with the nuts and bolts of the syntax and the grammar associated with what they did. But the creative element, they said, was uniquely human, and they would not admit that it helped them be more creative, which was a very interesting first kind of study. So then I went and presented at Oxford over the summer on metaversities. And then I happened upon a a Stanford neuroscientist who admitted that they had used, once again, ashamedly admitted that they had used AI to help finish their dissertation. And it struck me as odd that it was their findings, their study, their data, their analysis, but there was somehow shame attached to it in using this. So then I came back and I brought the team together and said, hey, this is what's going to be happening moving forward. We need to stop these other studies that we were doing. We generally do about 30, human subject studies every semester. And we need to start focusing on this. So the first thing we did was look at, okay, how is this actually going to impact how we teach, English composition? So we did several studies in creative writing and composition on that side. So that led to another book that we have coming out on one of my co-authors wants to call it the last textbook, because now everything's going to be hyper personalized in how we actually communicate things. So we're not really going to need textbooks in the same way that we have them now. But and then we did 6 other studies associated with art and design, which I think is a part of what you're interested in here as well, across the U.S. So from community colleges, vocational schools, to teaching institutions, historically Black colleges, and then research institutions. So we did that in everything from digital art to drawing to 3D design to web design, and looked at what is this going to mean for creative fields, right? And at that time, you had plenty of things that were already out. You already had DALL-E, you already had DALL-E Mini, you had Stable Diffusion, you had. That's what was interesting about what happened here with AI, is that we were predicting the creative output or content generation to come last, right, after 2030, and it hit first, right, becoming widely available in the summer of 2022, as you were mentioning, on social media. And so it completely upended all of our predictive models that we had for what's going to be automated when. So then we just continued from there. We just had a book that came out on it. So in Creative Convergence, that was last week, on the practical way in which to integrate this into art and design classrooms. But it also gives you a historical framing for this is the 4th industrial revolution. We're about to head into the 5th industrial revolution. So right now we're dealing with the Internet of Things. We're dealing with, social media, smartphones, etc. But then, next we're going to be pairing large language models with robotics and truly seeing the potential of what is in a nascent phase now. So that's what's coming up, and that's what we're looking forward to and kind of preparing for.
Wow, I mean, I think there's so much to unpack there. I definitely have to make sure I pick up your book and take a read at that, because I think, well, I would say first and foremost, initially, what I find most surprising about your journey here is, in a world where the pandemic hits and most teachers or professors, they're just learning how to use Zoom. You're
Yep.
tasked with like developing XR worlds and having to like explore AI in a very different way. And as you described, you and the folks that were designed and tasked with working on this, you actually had to use AI when it was like really hardcore. It's not like these simple little prompts and what it is now. You actually had to use the coding, the complexity, some of those barriers that have since been reduced and mitigated with how AI has evolved even in this last year. You had to do that. So I'm astounded by that. I think something else that really stood out to me, and we'll maybe have to revisit this in just a second with as we talk about content creation and what this means for young
Mm-hmm.
people. But I find the piece that you mentioned about shame and trust related to leveraging AI for creativity. I'd never heard that before. I find that very fascinating. And I also wonder if maybe that's part of the root for some of these like big backlash, just conflicts we're seeing across the acting field with copyright, with some of these other things. So I'm really curious to dig into that here in just a second. But before we get too far there, I'm also really curious to just hear more about your experience day to day, just as the department head, at Lindenwood, interacting with students, being able to do there. So if we could just sit there for a minute, I'm curious, like, how has your day to day changed with the emergence of ChatGPT in terms of what people are asking you, in terms of what your students are doing? How is that evolved?
Yeah, and as far as your the just what you do during the day and your workflow has dramatically changed as well. So of course, before we were helping them build out, virtual exhibitions, virtual worlds, recreating things with 3D models. So we're teaching Blender, Maya, 3ds Max, all of that. It was very laborious. So the main thing that changed really was the speed and variety of different tasks that can be accomplished and are expected to be accomplished. And that's what is key to understand the future of work moving forward, is that we can produce so much content now. Of course, it requires still an understanding of how to direct that content, whether or not it's quality, how it fits within a broader context, of previous things that were made like it. So there is, of course, a measure of quality control there, but you're still able to do a lot of different things more rapidly. And so prior to the stable release a year ago yesterday, we were pretty prolific, right? We already had established a decentered author model where we're looking at collaborating with people across silos. So in academia, unfortunately, we're incentivized to work alone and not share our research and findings for fear that we won't get the credit for it because ideas are academic currency. But that slows down progress a lot. So you might have someone working on an idea that might take 5 to 10 years to get out, which could benefit everyone immediately in other ways that they wouldn't think of if they were to share those ideas. So we were already doing that and publishing, roughly like maybe 30 articles a year, maybe averaging a book a year, if that. So I think my record prior to this type of writing tools being available was, I think, 3 hours to write an article start to finish. That's going to be, coming up with a concept, doing all the research, gathering all the information, condensing it manually, looking for patterns, and then, outputting results. So I could type pretty fast and do that, right? So now, if I can, now pretty much every academic database has these generative tools built in. Everything from Perplexity AI, JSTOR is building one in. I mean, the most traditional academic databases. So we can find out what is the latest on a given topic instantaneously and then condense that, synthesize it, right, very quickly. So now my record is about 30 minutes, right? So to give you an idea, so what is possible has been greatly expanded, by these tools. But we're also doing a lot of different things, right? So now, because it's multimodal and we're teaching the students this, and a lot of people still haven't really fully realized what's possible this moment, right? Not science fiction, not in the future, but I'll go back and forth if I'm going to be making a keynote speech or presentation for a conference, and I'll take the abstract that I wrote, have it outline what are the key points I need to hit. I'll have it generate the images for the slides, right? So output the images, go back and forth the data visualization, take a survey data I have from an Excel spreadsheet, have it generate bar graphs and or pie charts, scatter plots, etc. So it's being able to do all of that one after the other, instead of in the past, we would have to focus on one task for an extended period of time and then move to another task. So that's the major difference now, especially in how we're going to be producing things, is it's iterative. You go back and forth, that being, okay, now I need this type of text. Here's the information I need. Now, has anything been said about this, or has research, been done on this topic? Okay, now come back. Now I need an image that's going to be illustrating that, like, digital twins in airports, for instance, for sustainability. We just published on that. So give me a digital twin of an airport that illustrates, how we're going to be utilizing that. And then you go back, it's like, okay, here's the data I've collected, now give me a data visualization of that. Now I'm going to write up some results, right? So you go back and forth much more rapidly. Now write a social media post, announcing that this is coming out, or we need to come up with a survey to figure out how people are going to be visualizing the world differently for our latest neuroarts or neuroaesthetics books. So what type of synesthesia, or different types of sensory processing conditions do we need to be considering? So you can do all of that very quickly and simultaneously. So one of our colleagues here in the religion department reminded me that Thomas Aquinas would dictate to 4 different scribes 4 different books, section by section, when he was just telling them. So he had to keep in mind, here's the chapter that we're talking about in this book. Now continue writing in this book. Now continue writing in this book. Well, that's what we're doing now. So this is what generative AI allows you to do is, okay, here's this project. Okay, now let's move to this project. Okay, move to this project. And that's that's really going to be the future of work, is not that you'll be working longer, but you'll be producing a greater variety of things and more of them.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting, and that also resonates with me tremendously. I think when I look at some of the big mainstream tools that come out, as organizations like Microsoft and Google finding ways to integrate AI tools within the productivity tools they already have, right? Canva
Mhm.
doing the same thing. And so, to your point, I think there's still a learning curve that exists, especially for current professionals, about how to optimize their workflow to do this in the same way that you point, right? Like, hey, you can actually sit here and spend 65 minutes developing a slide deck, or you can take your basic ideas, run it through one of these. You may save it you may do it in half the time, 25% of the time, and just everybody getting the muscle memory of doing that better. I think to your initial point, something I did not know, which I find very fascinating, is potentially the doctoral students of the future maybe not getting as hazed as as they once were, right? With as you described, these generative AI tools being built directly into academic databases, where
Yep.
they're able to synthesize and curate research just a lot more efficiently, right? I think obviously what that also potentially creates, though, is in a world where you can now curate a lot faster, it means people are probably going to produce a lot faster. So it means the requirement may be that you are now having to vet and go through more resources to be able to publish something that is of quality than you had to before, because people are producing so quickly. But it'll be very interesting to see, even 5 years from now, as students are graduating from higher ed, if they have like really phenomenal professors such as yourself, or folks who have like really learned these tools really well, and just like how they come into work and how they work relative to folks who are not working in the same way, and just what that looks like, what the experience looks like, the way that they're producing versus not. And I'm just curious to see how that continues to disrupt the workforce as you've described, because what has been, so interesting, I think, for many of us, and as you alluded to earlier, is AI has really disrupted, white collar professions first and foremost, not blue collar professions, right? It seems like to be able to develop, manufacture, I think, above all as well, the type of technology that it takes to do that is just, there's going to need to be a longer runway for us to actually get to that at scale, versus what you've described, what we already do now with these large language models and some of the other tools that have developed from that. It's making work so much faster for folks who can just catch on quickly and like really understand how to use these tools. I'd love to turn back a little bit to your earlier, thought around artistry.
Mhm.
It's something I've been thinking a lot about, especially as I think about what I'm hearing on the ground related to what seems to be happening too with our young people. So, day to day, when I'm not interested in exploring AI, I'm in the field of college access, and so I have the privilege of being able to interact with students across like high schools and really help them to just really discover their passions, and as they decide to transition to their ideal post-secondary option after high school. And so one thing that I've just observed about the upcoming generations relative to earlier generations is, with these emergence of social media, with YouTube being what it is today, there's so many more students that are interested in some type of content creation, right? Whether it's streaming, whether it's YouTube videos, whether it's creating TikTok, some of these things. And so there appears to be this like tremendous appetite for our young people, and they've identified as a path of prosperity for themselves,
Mhm.
content creation, which in of itself is a form of artistry, right? Here, and I know that this is not precisely like the type of artistry that you're doing with the visual arts, but I would imagine there's probably a lot of connections and relations to this. And then at the same time, I'm seeing like these large events that are happening around us over this past year that have really created an additional disruption, similar to probably what happened 15 years ago with when Napster first came out, or something like that, right? Where we're seeing folks who are taking the name, image, likeness of famous artists and creating songs that are like amazing, amazing, really good songs, and they're popular and they're great. You're seeing this with videos as well. You're seeing this in with images, and just really across content creation. You're seeing a disruption there. The backlash seems to be strikes, right? At least in some ways, and then or there's lawsuits happening across the place around copyright. And I'm just curious, in a world where you are focused on really exactly this, right? The intersection between AI and XR disruption and artistry. Like, how are you making sense of all of this? What are you teaching your young people about how to prepare to be successful in this like very, very revolving field?
Great question. Yeah, and so and really, it's about context, and we need to go back in time to realize that this ain't our first rodeo, right? We've done this several times, having to redefine ownership, IP, copyright, how to monetize your intellectual property. That happened with the Industrial Revolution. That happened with the advent of photography. That happened with, you go back to art in the age of reproducibility, right? So if we can exactly digitally or otherwise reproduce something exactly, what is the inherent value, and then how does that change our understanding of art? So we've been through all of this. We just we have to go through growing pains again in order to correct the market and how we establish and associate value with creativity and those products, and what do those products look like. So to go back to what we were saying, I was thinking about that right before this interview, in that when I was in school, I got a bachelor's degree in art for oil painting, and no one ever talked about anything related to arts entrepreneurship, copyright, IP, anything like that. It was very interesting because, of course, that was right. I was getting that right as Google was released before. It was before social media. Facebook was released 2004, before, once again, the smartphone in 2007. So, it was right around Napster, right? So exactly what you're talking about with Napster. And that's what I always want to bring up is, how music and how musicians monetize what they do radically changed after, once again, these streaming services and file sharing, et cetera, came out. So you have to look at, alternative ways to monetize what you're doing, whether it's going to be, on tour, merchandising, looking at other types of, ad revenues via YouTube. And that's funny you mentioned that people coming out of high school want to monetize things via YouTube, because that's what my son wants to do, and he's 8. He wants to be a YouTuber when he grows up. And I'm just like, okay, all right. So, but to answer your question about, copyright, we're ill prepared for how content is being generated, right? Not will be, but is currently being generated, the capacity for it, and how people associate that with legal protections and monetizing it. So that's got to catch up. And if previous generations are anything of an indicator of what's going to happen, it's going to be incremental, right? So you're going to start off, as you see here, we've already seen where we're going. The Grammys, officially stated that you had to have at least 30% of a song being made by a human in order to qualify for a Grammy. They said that the text could be copyrighted in the famous, lawsuit against Zendaya and the Dawn, but not the imagery, because the idea is that you can't cite AI as an author. So once again, the idea of protections of an AI legally currently don't exist. So I'm very interested to see how that's going to change moving forward because of copyright and IP. But what they came up with was the judge stated in the most recent case that it had to have a significant amount of human intervention as part of a work of art to be copyrighted, and you couldn't have the author be AI. It still had to be a human. Needed to be the author. And so we're seeing, starting off, think of like Photoshop, right? So you bring in a picture or a painting that you made or a drawing that you made, and you modify it slightly with these digital tools. So that's kind of how we're thinking about it now is, here's the human element, what I put into it. And so now I'm just modifying it slightly with these tools. That's kind of where we're at. If you look at Adobe Firefly and how it's being advertised, I saw an ad on YouTube just, before this interview, to where, you upload a picture of yourself and you might cut out some background and put like a chateau behind you or make modifications. But then much like mixed reality with XR, you still know where you're at. You still have the overlay and the human actors involved. So you just see the additional modifications, kind of like, additional CGI. But the real world is still there. So we're in this in-between stage, right, before we move on to full-blown CGI, full-blown AI content creation, and our relationship to it is going to change. It's going to take us a minute to be comfortable with it. I have a series on JSTOR Daily on it's a 3-part series on how we're redefining creativity. Again, this is not new, and we have to separate the anxieties people are feeling from aesthetic value and how we assign value to creative output. So to go back, we go back to 1917. Marcel Duchamp is going to submit a urinal to an art exhibition, and it causes an uproar because he said that he purchased it from a plumbing store, didn't modify it at all, but because he saw it as art, it was art. And so that's kind of the birth of conceptual art at that point, in that it wasn't the manual crafting or something that he made. It was all conceptual. And so we already have a long history of this. You have artists or photographers that were famous for taking photographs of other artists' photographs, right? And so copies of copies of copies. And so this is not a new idea. What we need to deal with now really is AI psychology. It's going to be the human element. And so our studies, I think I can answer it most clearly. It took us about 3 years to figure this out. But so starting out, I mentioned our very first study. We were very curious as to why they would not allow even a modicum of credit to be given to AI for creativity, right? Because they found that to be their identity. So after a while, we began pulling that out. And as you were saying with the students you're talking about, this democratizes content creation. So, I mean, technically anyone can make a song, can make, now with Pico 1.0, can make, movies, videos, right? Can make, different types of visual imagery, right? Screenplays, right? So you can put all this together. So it democratizes it. So then, the question then becomes, why does this make us so uncomfortable, and what's happening? So what we found in our research is that there are 3 different indicators for adoption or rejection of these new AI tools. And the first one is the threat of identity loss. So this notion that you're an artist, you're a musician, you're an actor, right? So et cetera. So if you're not an artist, what are you? Right. So there's that. So we found that individuals that were studying across the U.S. in all different types of institutions, age, race, ethnicity, gender, it didn't matter. We found out this is common to all of them. If they identified with whatever the task was being carried out by the AI, they were very hostile towards it because it threatened who they were. So there's number one, there's that identity, that being, that's what I am, right? So I'm a teacher, I'm an artist. The other one, very importantly, which, we have to separate out, I was actually in an oral defense for a master's student yesterday who was an artist and is obviously very anti-AI art, is separating out, this notion of do we really dislike it because of the fundamental change in aesthetics and creativity, or is it because it's going to take our job, right? So let's just go into, the fear and anxiety of job loss or displacement. So I remember in 2017, there was a nationwide survey of the fears of Americans, and the fear of being replaced by a robot ranked above death, right? And so we're more afraid of robots than dying. But it's losing our vocation. So we have to admit that, okay, so that is a real concern. We need to address that. That being, yes, we're going to have to learn different skills and do different things. So we need to meet that head on instead of brushing it under the rug, right? The third one, which is interesting, is also going to be subject matter expertise loss. That being, so you find that those in computer science who are, AI researchers or machine learning specialists, et cetera, they were the last to kind of, start using these tools because they were the experts in it, right? So they no, I know AI. I don't need this. I know the real stuff. I'm the expert. The same thing with, English teachers. That being, it's like, I don't need ChatGPT. I teach writing. I do that. That's me, right? So there's that expertise. Another element, which is very important to mention here, that we just found out about, that you were touching on a moment ago, is AI guilt. Right. So this is finally a term. It took us a long time to figure this out, to put our finger on it. What is that feeling of unease at using these tools and accomplishing something more quickly? Why do we feel icky about it? So we finally figured that out. It was coined. It's out there in social media now over the last month. But we found out about it because we had professors that have an entire network, about 100 of them, that are very pro emergent technology, We know this is the future. We know this is, how things are going to be done. They're teaching their students like I am. Here's how you do research with it. Here's how you make images with it. Here's how to maximize your workflow and your output. But they weren't using it themselves, which is very interesting. And so I'm like, okay, you're showing them how to do all of this. Why aren't you using it, right? So I had one English professor in particular who he was spending over 80 hours a week still manually grading papers that were turned in, like 60 of them he had to spend, he was told, when he was coming up through his doctoral program, that in order to be a good English professor, you need to spend at least 15 minutes per paper, right? Editing it manually, right? And so they still have this idea that if I don't do that, I feel like I'm not doing my job. So the time and effort put in is often equated to the value that we put in something or place on something. And so if we feel somehow we're not doing that, then it results in that feeling of AI guilt. So that's something. So what we're looking at now moving forward is not difficult upskilling to teach people to integrate these technologies and how to do it. It's to really deal with the human side of it, the human aspect of it, because it's challenging our very identities. And that's very real, right? As far as a lot of the emotional reactions you were talking about, it's not just financial, it's not just losing your job, right? So it's these other, psychological considerations.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I don't think I've ever thought about it that way. I'm somebody in, my role though, interestingly enough, I've spent a lot of time managing people and managing teams, and we often talk about how within change management there are these periods of grief or anxiety as people like really begin to conceptualize or like draw connections to where you're going, even if the change is good. And so
Yep.
I think I know this obviously, but it was just very interesting to hear the context that you put into this. Is in some ways what's happening across society as a whole, right? People are really trying to grapple and understand, how is this not just beyond my economic well-being, right? And then to your initial point, this is probably even exacerbated for artists, because as an artist, like, you're really wearing in so many ways like your heart on the sleeve, right? Like, as you said, it's probably more likely, your vocation is probably more likely tied to your identity
Mhm.
relative to some other roles where someone may just be doing a job and just see it as a job. They're like, this is my job, and I go home and that's when I do the stuff I like to do. But as an artist, like, you're really going into that because you love art. And I can imagine how tough it might be to feel like these things aren't just a threat, not just to your livelihood, but who you are. All right, as you described. And they're likely what we'll have to change that, just as in any really thoughtful change management, is really connecting the dots for people to
Mhm.
like what their role, what their identity, what their just overall way of being looks like in the future, in this future, where that change is headed. So I think that just really drew a connection for me that I had not been thinking about. So appreciate you for bringing that up. I'm curious, could you say a little bit more though? I know that you it seems like, from what I'm understanding about your pedagogy here, it seems like you still really lead in conversations with your students around the artistry. Like, it sounds like you really want them to develop their oil painting, or develop those pieces first and foremost, and then think of the AI tools as like an enhancer in some way, right? Or as like a supplement. But I'm curious, could you say maybe more about your pedagogy, or how the types of framing or insights you are offering your students to like really give, to try to prepare them as best you can for a world that we actually aren't even sure what it's going to look like once they graduate?
Yes. So to answer the first question, it's outlined. We have plenty of studies that are out there. You can find them on ResearchGate, Google Scholar for free. They're not behind paywalls. And we also have that book that just came out for the actual exercises, assignments, and rubrics and everything of how we're doing it. But as with anything, we generally start, as you mentioned, and it's probably advisable in any creative field to introduce it in terms of a supplemental tool for ideation, or the iterative or the formative part of the creative process. So we start with, instead of making 50 thumbnail sketches of logos, make me 100, different variations, and then, select 5, tell me why those 5 are going to be the best choices and how they're actually going to be communicating the content of the particular company you're looking for and or this idea, etc. So we use it as a kind of, whereas previously thinking would occur between the mind and a sketch pad, for instance, or something external, it's now now happening through the mind, and these generative elements, which you can change much more rapidly. That being, now give me, a cool color scheme. Now give me an analogous color scheme. Now once again make it metallic. Now make it so you can do it much more rapidly and get ideas fleshed out, right? So that's how we start, is emphasizing, do 10 different prompts, right, for understanding the combination of different household objects. For instance, this was an assignment for 3D design, that you would find around the house, and how they could come together in novel ways, like a stapler and a hammer, and or scissors and a coffee mug, right? So thinking of a three-dimensional form in new and novel ways, and coming up with that. But then you go out and you output it in a different medium, right? So you go out and you make a drawing. You're going to put something together, with clay, right? Something in the physical world. So that's where we start, is by not entirely replacing the full creative process, but by showing how it can assist in these formative stages. The other way, of course, is you keep the traditional formative stage. You output things yourself, and then just like with Photoshop, you see how these tools can help you refine something at the end, right? So we have a series of assignments which build from just learning what the tools can do, up through different types of output, up through complete final product creation. The difference is, as we found, just like with writing, is that, and that's really the difference in the democratized part that you're talking about, in that anyone can create content. Yes. Is it good? They need to know what good looks like, right? And so that's kind of where we settled on, as far as the pedagogy is concerned, in that in order to write a good essay, yes, you can copy a prompt and write me something about the Gettysburg Address, in 1,000 words, and it'll output it, right? But if you say, now expand on that, write me a chapter on it, they have no idea really what to do, we found. That being, because you need to know the structure of an argument, different rhetorical styles. And the same thing with art and design. You need to have a good solid foundation in color theory or composition, right? So line, these formal elements. Same thing you mentioned with cinema, that being, of course, and that's really where we're moving, is teaching people to be discerning editors and directors. That being, okay, how do I get this effect from my audience? Okay, so I need them to feel wary or trepidatious or something, in this way. I need an effect that's going to be foreboding, right? So, and or to set up this foreshadowing, right? So, what novel ways can we do that? And so, obviously, if you run it through AI currently, it comes back with several standard tropes that it leans on again and again in these analogies. But the training of knowing what something should look like in the end is going to be more important. So really, the first draft is dead, that being for essays and for sketches, things like that. So the first iterative part is always going to be done for us. We're going to be thinking of ourselves instead as one of my colleagues would mention, as Michelangelo and the block of marble. That being, we're going to have the block of marble, but it's going to be a lot of stuff we don't need. So we need to learn how to chip away and get to the figure underneath that we want. But we have to know what that looks like, right? So you need to know where you're going, which is why we always say, in the simplest terms, that's why we actually had buttons made back in January of AI is my co-pilot.
Those are awesome.
Yeah, so we had those stickers made and buttons made. You have to think about it in terms of you need to know where you're going. So if you don't know where you're going, AI is not going to help you. So as a pilot, and you say, okay, I'm flying from New York to London, so I know where I am, I know where I want to go, right? But so it can help you then plot the course, it can help you, plot the trajectory, the best route, etc. But you need to know what it's supposed to look like in the end, right? So so that's the best way we kind of explain it, whether it's research or fine art, etc. Is that you need enough knowledge, a body of knowledge to go off of, a schema, a framework, so that you can then much more rapidly get to the result that you want, instead of stumbling around in the dark and you have really no evaluative way to determine whether the quality is good.
Yeah. I mean, that resonates so much. I think I found the same thing just when I've tried to use ChatGPT in particular for college access use cases, and I've actually talked to other folks too, who do like talent search, executive recruiting, and the same thing as you described. It's like content matters, right? It's like up to this point, even if you're doing very specific prompting to say you are an expert in this field or you're an expert here, you when you're getting a product back, if you're somebody who is actually an expert within that field, you are still going to notice that it's pretty good, but it's still like a C plus relative to what like hitting the gold standard really is.
Mhm.
Very curious, obviously, to see if that continues to be a trend 5 years from now or something like that, as these models continue to get smarter. But at least for now, I totally agree with you that the sharper and the stronger you are within the context of your discipline, and then the more you can understand the computational thinking needed to like access these tools, really when I say computational thinking, I mean just you're like teaching it essentially. You just have enough understanding of the field you're in to be able to say yes, this, no, this, do this, right, and just being able to like coach it in that way. That I think really allows you to unlock its full potential. So that resonates. I also think one thing that I'm curious about with maybe before I go there, I think just one quick connection I also made is I totally agree with you about the AI as a co-pilot piece. I mean, for me, when I was using ChatGPT for the first time in January last year, I
Mhm.
mean, the first thing I thought of is like, oh my god, like I got Jarvis now. Like
Mhm.
I'm Tony Stark and I just got my Jarvis, right? And to your point, I in the same way that Tony Stark in all of the Iron Man movies, like he had a very clear vision of how he was using Jarvis. Jarvis was not instructing him about
Mhm.
where they were going. He was using that, and Jarvis was doing the quick math, all those things. But he was like, "I'm building this suit. This is what I want it to look like. This is how we're doing it." That was really the potential I saw, and it sounds like that is very much the role you all have really tried to define within your students, and even in your own use cases, as well as giving everybody their own Jarvis, right, within the context of your daily life. I'm curious. So to transition a little bit here, higher education, obviously, in so many ways, especially in the United States, tends to be the leader of disrupting technology and disrupting like practices when it comes to just like the thought leadership in the country, right, and how we do things. And so, knowing that I could just speak from experience and from other conversations I've had, like K to 12 is nowhere near what you all are doing in higher education with generative AI tools. I would say, like, what lessons have you learned? And I know you've also done some research in this area as well, but like, what lessons have you learned either from your experiences in higher ed or your research about what K to 12 schools and districts could be doing to like move the needle in AI implementation?
That's very interesting, and we learned more yesterday. So we have a chapter out on that. We surveyed over 5,000 educators in all 50 states to figure out where they were at, what their concerns were, what their level of proficiency was, what they thought they needed, etc. And we've done lots of studies in higher ed as well. I should state we'll start with the higher ed side, and then I can tell you the latest on the K through 12. So. Obviously, there was a knee-jerk reaction back in January. Everyone went down for the long winter's nap after the stable release of ChatGPT in November. Didn't realize the world changed, and then had to figure out what to do about it in January. So many of them just outright banned it to give themselves time, is really what it was, to understand it. And now, of course, those same schools are all 100% on board and want to integrate it. But of course, it's slow going. And we can tell you why. So there was a gold rush that was an AI gold rush that was announced over the summer. So everything you saw is companies are going to triple their earnings, the Nasdaq, et cetera. And then the first quarter reports came out after the fiscal year, July 1, and it didn't happen. You find that you didn't see this improvement in profits, right, or even moving the needle on P&L for the profit and loss in that way. And the reason is, and we saw it here, we went to our internal upskilling arm that we have in the institution, Lindengage, and said, we put out, a call. We'll go out and help, mid-sized companies, upskill, show them how to use this, how to improve things with front of the house, communications, how to maximize their workflow. complete silence. And then later on, 6 months later, we went back and what happened? And what was said was very interesting and telling, and kind of contextualizes everything else. And that is that they knew it was important. They knew they should be integrating this into these are CEOs into their organizations, but they were afraid that if they taught people how to use it, they would use it and use it badly. And get them in trouble. And so that kind of led to the reports that were coming out, like, why didn't we have this mass adoption? So everyone knew they needed to use it, but there were two reasons, right? So one was most firms, and this includes, higher education institutions, were fearful of exposing their data. So they were afraid of it getting out there and leaking, et cetera. So especially fiscal affairs information. So they all wanted to build their own enterprise system. So that leads to problem two. They didn't have internal expertise nor the resources because there weren't that many people that could build those, right, for every company to hire. And so that led to a hurry up and wait scenario. So that's kind of where all of higher education is at this very moment, is they're waiting for those. We're building our own, but they're also waiting on OpenAI announce their enterprise solution. So you can, of course, have your closed system, and you can put all of your data and control your data. So you don't have to worry about FERPA or HIPAA, et cetera. But that's what was holding everyone up. So from an institutional standpoint, obviously, we were continuing to upskill, staff and students. We can do whatever we want in the classroom. That being, like, here's the future. How is this going to work? With these tools that you will need for your future of work in this way. So we continued in that way. It was the institutional data, right, that a lot of people were afraid of. On top of that, we're part of another study that with over 20 institutions internationally, we're looking at what to do as far as a plan of integrating these generative models into their processes. And what we found was, especially R1 institutions and the Ivy Leagues, considered it only an undergraduate teaching problem. They're just like, oh no, this is just a thing. You teachers figure it out. We don't have to worry about it. It doesn't impact research or institutional, processes, etc. That's just something for assessment. That's an assessment hiccup, right? You figure that out. So they're finally coming around after that dismissal and realizing that it needs to be in everything as well. But that leads us to K through 12. So with the restrictions and the concerns over data privacy that we have, and then, of course, upskilling your teams and expertise necessary across an institution. It's doubly so for K through 12, right? So as far as the additional requirements for the protection of minors, right, in that way. But after I was talking to them yesterday, my son is on an IEP, so I was meeting with them. We had our 3-year review, and I brought that up, and they're like, "Oh yeah, sure, that's fine," because I've been telling people this for a while. That being, it's gonna permeate K through 12 before it gets all the way through colleges, because it's gonna take a full generation for it to fully infiltrate every type of lecture class of how different topics are taught at the post-secondary level. But the secondary level, the people you're talking to, it's going into a Google Classroom, right? So once again, Google, where they're launching Gemini, but they already announced that they're putting these generative writing tools on all Google Chromebooks, which is what my son's given to take home on snow days, right? And so the only thing is they're not as worried about it because they don't really teach them to fully learn how to type. They have autocomplete and all of that. Until they hit around 4th or 5th grade, right? And so my son is just now learning different ways to type, but he can't type as of yet. And so they're not as concerned with how it's kind of structured. And they think that by the time they get to that point, we can build in enough AI literacy so that they can't really do enough, damage or get themselves in too much trouble. But of course, they're also not realizing that, we have things like Pi and other personal assistants that my son will just go and talk about Pokemon with, for like 2 hours. And how many ice types are there? What's the weakness of a steel type, right? So what's the strongest one? So, and he'll just talk and talk and talk. So we're having a generation now that we're going to have to realize is coming up very quickly with Gen Alpha, that being my children. So my son, if I don't know something, he just goes right to Alexa and goes, Alexa, answer this question, right? Or he'll go in and say, I want to make another Pokemon card, Dad. So he'll say, okay, I want a dragon and dark type. I want it to look like this, right, etc. And then he's like, okay, it generated now. What do you want to call it? Well, let's ask AI, right? It's like, so I want it to be, these combination of different things. And so he spits it out and then he assembles it all together, right? So we're talking about a generation that grew up making anything, creating anything, right? As far as the content of what they can think becomes reality. And so this is something we need to start incorporating, and being prepared for at higher ed.
Yeah, that resonates so much, especially your last point. I mean, something that I've been thinking quite a bit about, just given my experience working. I have the privilege in my role to be able to talk with school leaders across the state of Massachusetts, and what I've just observed about those conversations is there's still so many school districts, at least in that state, and just based on other contexts I have in other states as well, that aren't really thinking about AI or not prioritizing it relative to the many other challenges that they have. So I'm very empathetic about that. I know how difficult K to 12, especially in large urban school districts, is, and how many challenges there are that feel more pressing than trying to figure out how to implement AI and in what ways it can come up. But I think to your point, what I'm also concerned about is what happens if so many of our children, our young people, they end up experiencing AI in so many different ways outside of the classroom, and then they come into school and then they just feel like stifled. They're like, this is like the education system of the 1920s. I mean, there's probably a lot of young people that already feel that way regardless of AI, right? But they
Yep.
just feel like the system is just so far behind what they're able to access in their own experiences outside of the class, playing video games or going on social media or just using productivity tools like that, that the implementation of K to 12 and how it may not actually keep up with the trajectory of what our young people are able to do. It may not actually just prepare them for the world that they're going to be entering 12 years after they start.
Yeah, that's a great point. And it went back to one of your first questions was, what if they don't learn about it in school? And so, because as my kids are certainly working with AI on a daily basis, but not in a school context, in entertainment context. And this goes back and it reminds me of I was in school and I had the privilege of having the school nurse as a mother. So I had the embarrassment of her going out and giving sex ed talks, right, and talking about abstinence, etc.
Oh,
And it reminds me a lot of that being what you're talking about, that being if the whole approach to AI is to abstain from using it, then bad things are going to happen, right? So you have to teach them in the same way as far as good, safe social media practices or cell phones, that being, don't share certain content, right? That's going to be out there forever when you're 10 years old, right? So it's always there, right? So we had to go through a period. It's common sense now, but earlier when parents are figuring out what was happening and kids didn't understand the consequences of their actions or what was happening to the content they were putting out there, it's the same way now, is that we have to be teaching this, in school so that they don't think about AI in terms of a search engine or something that's entirely factual. Right. And understand that it's based on the data that we're providing it. And a lot of that data can be biased, right? It can be incorrect. So they need to be able to point that out, to be critical of the output in order to correct it. As I always say, we're not passive here. Everyone feels that the world is changing, but we're generating mountains of content. So think of 90% of all the data in all of history was produced in the last 2 years, right? It's a common thing. But
wow.
now multiply that, right? Because we're in the past year, we've generated 1,000 times that, right? So think of everyone under the sun is outputting, mountains of this stuff that's going back out there and training the data, training these large language models and others as well. And so every time we run something, say, write an email or analyze this or, give me a recipe, every time that goes back in, it's reinforcing that, right? So every time we need to teach them, these responsible ethical practices for AI, in that if they ask for, give me an image of a professional and it just gives you a middle-aged white guy, in a suit, you're like, no, that's not what professionals all look like. So, run it again and correct it, with greater diversity. And so if we're not doing that, right, we're continuing to reinforce these things. So that's kind of what I wanted to hammer home when they're discussing, do we or do we not, let students use it. They absolutely need to use it so that you can point out how it actually works so they can use it for good.
Yeah. No, that resonates so much. And again, I think just like with anything else, in particular in education, it's like we're always waiting for it to be like 100% ready. And the reality is we probably have to lead with something that's at 70% because the opportunity cost of not doing it is like significantly worse, as we saw with social media and really
Mhm.
with cell phones, and what the impact of that has been on our young people without guidance on how to use those things appropriately.
Mhm.
I know you're a very busy man and got to go soon. I want to hit you with a couple lightning round questions just
Sure.
to close out here. First and foremost, what excites you about AI, and what are you worried about?
Sure. I mean, what excites me is what we're looking at. I go back a year ago, and I remember a lot of the limitations and the criticisms levied against the capabilities of AI at that time. That being, as far as the artists would point out, oh, it can't do hands. Its anatomy is all wrong. You can immediately pick it out. You have academics go, it hallucinates. It gets facts wrong. It can't cite things. It can't, once again, quote, right? So it has all these limitations. So it can't do anything. I mean, even at Noam Chomsky. And you fast forward, and our team, of course, we're looking at that going, well, look at what it looked like a year ago, right? Now, what do you think it's going to look like in a year? So
Yeah,
what excites me is this exponential growth in capabilities that we've seen just in 1 year. And remember that just snowballs, right? So the ability of what we're going to have next year is going to be just amazing, right? So I mean, you'll be able to make your own TV shows tailored to what you want. So you like Star Wars, and you want to sub a plot for one character, so I go off and then start running that particular that episode based on that one and give me a backstory, etc. That's going to be a thing, right? So you'll be able to customize and personalize your entertainment, your experience of the world, coupled with, of course, hardware such as the smart glasses, to where we can actually overlay from reality to augmented to mixed to full virtual reality. We have that with contact lenses now. It's just that it kind of freaks people out to put them on their eyes. It's going to become much more affordable and much more readily available. So the ability of that to support many different types of people is going to level the playing field, both socioeconomically and for education as well. So all neurodiverse types, those with dyslexia, dysgraphia, ADHD, autism, etc., or those that might not have had access to really expensive hardware or even the internet, right? As when they were growing up. So it's really going to be a great equalizer. At the same time, what is really scary is we need to be prepared for what's going to happen, and that is we're going to have to be doing different things, and we also have to separate our identities from our vocations. That being, we are no longer going to be a doctor or a lawyer or a professor or an artist, right? So we have to find other value and meaning for ourselves, which is going to be difficult because you go back in all of history, you were a scribe, you were a blacksmith, you were a butcher, you were a baker, right? So this is there's not a lot of precedent that we have in the recent past to model this on. So there's a broad sweeping psychological consideration for society. The other one is, of course, we're going to need, just like in the Great Depression, governmental services to support upskilling, right? That being, okay, this type of profession may not be required anymore, so we're going to pay you to learn to do this now. But that might be a 6-month training period in which you need to be supported in order to get to that stage. So those are the other considerations that I don't think are being widely considered at this time.
that's great, James. I appreciate your thoughts there, and I just want to close out with just an opportunity. If folks are really interested in connecting with you, learning more about so much of the thought leadership you've contributed to this field, how could they engage with you or read some of your materials?
Oh, absolutely. So you can find, you go on either Google Scholar or ResearchGate, you type in James Hutson, Hutson. If you type in my institution as well, Lindenwood University, you'll find over 100 resources there on the subject. And then, of course, you can connect with me on LinkedIn, social media. You can find me. I'm, of course, lead XR Disruptor at Lindenwood University, but I'm happy to connect and to share whatever I know.
Dr. James Hudson, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, Daniel. You have a great day.
Thanks for listening to the AI Education Conversation. Give a follow, rate, and review wherever you listen. For all show notes and to share your thoughts on today's episode, check out the AI Ed Convo on Twitter. See you next time.